Hello everyone, my name is Matt, also known as the Survivor Guy, and today I'm going to be showing you the optimal strategy to Survivor's Totem Pole Challenge using physics.
For today's challenge, it's very simple. You will hold onto a pole for as long as you can. If you fall off, you're out of the challenge.
A large component of Survivor is using the skills that you've acquired from things that you do every day in your normal life to help you in the game of Survivor. And as a physics teacher, whenever I'm watching the show, I'm always looking at the challenges through a physics lens, thinking about if I were there in the moment, what things could I do that would give me an advantage over other people using the knowledge of physics that they may not have. And recently I've been thinking about how I might be able to incorporate physics into these videos, and something that really sticks with me is this clip of Yule in his first season on Cook Islands.
Where are you feeling it, Jonathan?
My feet a little bit. My feet are a lot bigger, so a little bit of rope is just harder, I guess. I don't know.
I think Jonathan has a point, though.
What's that?
Well, basically, the surface area supporting all of us is about the same, even if your feet are a little bit bigger or not. But, you know, your mass goes up at a faster rate than surface area. It's kind of like why elephants can't run up trees.
Just what I was thinking.
So in this clip, Yule is talking about something that's really out of our control. You can't change the surface area of the pole that they give you on Survivor, nor can you really change your mass, although over a long enough time on Survivor, your mass is going to decrease quite a bit. But it got me thinking, what ways can we use physics to our advantage in order to increase your likelihood of staying on that pole? And there are actually a few different things we can look at here. So the first, and probably the most obvious, is friction. Let's say I'm on this totem pole. There's me on the challenge in Winners at War, where I belong. So here I am up on my little totem pole, right? So in order to figure out, well, what's going to make it easiest for me to stay up there, we can use Newton's laws and look at, all right, what forces are acting on my body? The main force that's going to be opposing us in this challenge is the gravitational force, the force that pulls literally every object on Earth in the downward direction. So if I want to look at what forces are acting on this pole, well, I've got my force of gravity acting downward, and that is kind of my main enemy in this challenge, what I'm trying to lessen the effects of, if you will. We also know we have force going up, right? So force going up, well, I'm holding on, I'm pulling myself up, so we can say that's FA, or our applied force. And then we also have one more, and perhaps the most important one, we have the force of friction between me and the pole. If you've ever moved into a new place and tried to push your couch or your heavy furniture across the floor, a lot of the times to make it easier on yourself, you get these little mover things that you put underneath the legs of the couch or of the piece of furniture, and that decreases the friction between that object and the floor, which makes it easier, because what friction does is friction pushes back against motion. So applying that to Survivor's Totem Pole Challenge, well, force of gravity wants to pull me down, which means the way I'm going to move would be down, sliding down the pole, which means friction, opposing that motion, would be going up. So naturally, if I want to make it easier on myself, decrease my applied force, while still opposing the gravitational force, well, the one thing I'm going to want to do is increase my friction force as much as possible. So if I want to increase my friction force, well, what is the formula for friction? Well, the frictional force is given by this formula right here. FF is equal to mu Fn. Now, if you're not very comfortable with physics, you may be looking at that being like, Matt, what the hell does any of that mean? Those are random letters. You made that up. I did not make that up. It is a real formula, and all of these letters mean something. So FF, obviously, is our frictional force. Mu is what they call the coefficient of friction. And the coefficient of friction depends on what two surfaces are rubbing together, right? So, for example, the coefficient of friction between ice skates and ice is very, very low, which is why you can slide across ice while you're playing hockey and really not have much opposition. On the other hand, if you're rubbing two blocks of wood together, you may notice that's a bit harder than sliding across ice because the coefficient of friction between those two blocks of wood is higher. So really the way coefficient of friction works, the rougher the material, the higher the coefficient of friction, which means the higher frictional force, the smoother the material, the lower the coefficient of friction, the lower your frictional force. So if we want to have the highest force of friction moving up, we need to have the highest coefficient of friction between our body and the wooden totem pole. So the only way to change the coefficient of friction is change the material that's rubbing against the totem pole. Now, totem pole is made out of wood. That's given to us by Survivor. We can't change that at all. So the only thing that we can change is our body. And now you may be thinking, Matt, what do you mean change your body? I can't change what my skin is made out of. And that's the key word right there. So there are two ways that I could approach this challenge. On the picture that I've made of myself, I'm wearing a shirt. Well, my shirt is made out of cotton. Cotton has a lower coefficient of friction than my skin does. So if I want to maximize the frictional force on this totem pole, well, it would probably make more sense if I took off my shirt, wowed all the ladies, got Jeff oohing and ahhing, and made sure that my skin was in contact with the pole rather than my shirt. So bear hugging the pole while shirtless is going to increase our friction and make it so that we have to apply less force to keep us up, meaning our muscles can hang on for a bit longer. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about in regards to friction is we've been talking about this coefficient of friction and how we can increase it to maximize the frictional force that is opposing gravity. Well, here's where things get wild, because there are actually two different coefficients of friction. So there's something called the coefficient of static friction and the coefficient of kinetic friction. So coefficient of kinetic friction, like kinetic energy, which is the energy of movement, applies when an object is already in motion. So like say I were on the totem pole and I'm sliding downward, that would be the coefficient of kinetic friction. The coefficient of static friction, on the other hand, is the coefficient of friction that applies to an object that is not moving. And the coefficient of static friction is always higher than the coefficient of kinetic friction. So here's a little experiment you can do at home if you don't believe me. Go to your dining room table or your desk or some large piece of furniture that you know you're capable of moving, and give that a push. If you try and push that object, you may notice you have to apply the most effort once you start pushing it to get it to move, but once it's already moving, well, now it seems like it's easier to move. And the reason that it seems like it's easier to move is because it is. So before the object is moving, the coefficient of static friction is opposing the motion, which means your frictional force is higher. Once you get the object to move, well, now you have your coefficient of kinetic friction that's applying the frictional force, which means it's easier to move. So how can we apply this to Survivor's totem pole challenge? Well, the ideal thing to do, right? Bear hug that pole and hope that you don't start slipping. But eventually what's going to happen as you're holding onto that pole, it's hot in Fiji, you're going to start sweating. Sweat makes the coefficient of friction between your skin and the wooden pole decrease, which could be enough to get you to slip. And once you start slipping, well, now you switch from the coefficient of static friction to the coefficient of kinetic friction, which means the frictional force that's opposing gravity is less. So there are two ways that you can recover from this. Well, the first, squeeze tighter, right? If you're applying more force to keep yourself up, you're going to increase the force going upward and stop yourself from moving. But after however many days of only eating rice, you might not have a lot of energy in the tank. And this is where those little footholds can come into play and really save you in this challenge. Putting your feet on those footholds, you may notice survivors tend to get tired and end up in a lot of pain pretty quickly. So the less painful way to do it is to kind of bear hug that pole and let friction do its thing. But once you start sweating or you get tired and you kind of weaken your grip a little bit and you start slipping, well, now you have to apply a lot more force than you were before in order to recover. So those little footholds, well, you can put your feet in those footholds, which allows you to use more of your body to force up. And then once you've stopped yourself and you switched from coefficient of kinetic friction to coefficient of static friction, well, now you can return to that bear hug and you should be steady again. So I think an ideal strategy here would be to try and hug the pole for as long as you can. Once you start slipping, you use those little handholds and footholds to stop yourself and kind of take a moment to reconnect to what you're doing, get back to that bear hug, let friction do its thing again, and hope that you outlast everyone else. Another thing I'd like to quickly mention here, So far we've been talking about this bear hug method of holding onto the pole. And sometimes you see people taking different approaches, like you might see something like this, or like this, where they're not quite flush to the pole like I've been showing here. And you may be thinking, well, what about this method, right? Maybe this way you have more of your body on the pole, you're using those footholds, maybe that could be something that could give you an advantage. And actually, it's the exact opposite. The further that your body is from the pole, the more the gravitational force is going to be acting on you. And in order to explain why this is, we have to look at something called torque. So torque is basically a force that's being applied at a distance from the center of mass of an object. And that's a lot of physics terms. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, if you have a door on its hinges, the easiest place to open the door is from, well, the end of the door, where the door handle is. That's why the door handle is in the place that it's in. If you've ever tried to push a door open from near its hinges, you may notice, well, that's a bit harder. And the reason it's a bit harder is because the way that torque works is the further you are from where an object is going to rotate, the more that force that you're applying affects the object. So for example, I could apply the same force on the end of a door and open it all the way. If I go to the end where the hinges are and apply that same force, it might move very little. So what's going to happen if you're in a position like this? Well, gravity is still acting down, but now a lot of your mass is away from the pole, right? So you have gravity acting down over here, and this are where your points of contact with the pole are. So you have this distance between where gravity is pulling down and where your points of contact on the pole are. And because torque acts more the further away the force is acting from where your center of rotation is, we can say that your body is kind of like the door and your points of contact are kind of like the hinges. Well, now you have the force acting away from the hinges, so that's going to apply more torque than if you were closer. So you're going to feel the force of gravity acting more the further away you are from the pole than if you are bear hugging it and as close to it as possible. At the end of the day, this is an endurance challenge, so doing some endurance training is probably going to give you the best edge in this challenge. But seeing as building a 15-foot tall wooden pole and hanging on it for several hours isn't something I'm capable of doing, I think taking what I know of physics and applying it is the best way to give myself a bit of a leg up on the competition if I ever end up in a scenario where I am competing in this challenge. So there you have it, the optimal strategy for Survivor's Totem Pole Challenge using physics. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any suggestions for other Survivor challenges that you think it would be a good idea to analyze through the lens of physics, let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. And if you work at CBS, give me a call. Thanks for watching, everyone.